Good. Here we are, Module 5A, and this in a sense starts the second part of the program, and I hope you're keeping up to date with the assessments. In a sense, I've rolled up my sleeves for this second part because we're really into the hard work. That's not true, all of it's hard work, and hopefully all of it's enjoyable or in some sense productive work for you. We're going to focus a little bit more in on punctuation in this particular first part of Module 5, so let's get started. Yes, so the same old. Here's a list of instructions. Some of this is exercise based, so I would strongly urge you to keep the exercises there in the workbooks as part of your procedure. Some of these issues can be very well improved by repetitive exercises. So if you do find you're a little bit weak in some of these areas of punctuation, then go and do the exercises and do a set of them, and I think you'll find that that is going to be advantageous for you. Just a quick note here, point number 6 refers to last year. Instead of the webinars, forum discussions, please. It's great to see some people posting to the forums. If you have any question or you require some degree of clarification, then post to the forum, the general discussion forum, and start a conversation. That would be a great thing to see occurring. Keep in mind that very much so, we're into the second workbook now. All right, the first 4 modules covered in the first workbook, and now you should have that second workbook in hand. Where do you find it? Well, if you're asking that question, I wouldn't embarrass myself by putting it on the discussion forum because we've discussed this so many times already. Preparation and Unit Resources page on Moodle has both of the workbooks there. You should download and print them out, and from this point on we will be mainly, or entirely in fact, working from the second workbook. Here's your preparation and guidelines, and we're going to touch on some of those other punctuation elements such as semicolons, colons and commas. General advice. I want you to always separate introductory elements in a sentence, header elements, those bits that start off a sentence, from what follows with a comma. All right, so you might start a sentence with an adverb, for example. Yes, and then you follow with the dependent clause. Good. And you finish off with the main clause. There we have a complex sentence, yes? Each of these logical elements should be separated by a comma. Is that all right? Your adverb, unfortunately, while it was raining, main clause, the car broke down. Main clause, dependent clause, main clause. Unfortunately, adverb, comma, dependent clause, while it was raining, comma, main clause, the car broke down. Now, you can translate that into academic writing, but the point is adverbs to separate these key logical parts of a sentence from each other. Unless, of course, it's 2 compound sentences, 2 main clauses, in a compound sentence. And then, you know by now that we should use a semicolon here, don't you? So, unfortunately, it was raining, the car broke down. Then 2 main clauses, semicolon instead of a comma. My colleague, the coordinator of this program, Dr. Andrew Johnson, he actually suggests that if you're not familiar with how to use the semicolon, it's safer just not to use it. I would rather be a little bit more positive and teach you how to use it, and then you can show off that you are one of the few students in this universe who can use the semicolon accurately. Keep in mind full colons, again, a bit like the comma, often abused, typically never used properly, especially in a sentence when you are setting off a list. All right, let's put on the full screen again. This is a fairly typical use of the semicolon, isn't it? An introductory, a lead-in, semicolon, and then a list, 1, 2, 3. What I want you to think about is what comes here. What part of speech immediately before the colon. I would want you not to have a verb in particular at this point just before the full colon, sorry, yes? I want a noun. Good. But what people often do is X, Y, Z is A, B and C, or includes, and then the full colon. No, no verbs, please. That's one of the rules I would indicate or suggest for the use of the full colon. Good. So, we've already discussed in some depth semicolons right at the beginning of this program. No need to go back over it, I don't think. We've again reiterated it. When you look at this particular sentence format on the slide, it should be familiar. You've got two, what I might call bold, full colon, dependent, oh, gee, I'm getting lost here. Independent clauses next to each other. Adjacent, side by side, independent clauses, no coordinating conjunction. There goes your semicolon. Sometimes we write lists, and typically in a list we separate the items with a comma. 1, 2 and 3. 1, comma, 2, possibly a comma, and 3. That second comma is what we term the Oxford comma. It's not necessary. I don't mind if you use it or don't use it. But in a list with discrete or single items, we use commas. Now sometimes in a list, a very complex list, we might have one part of that list with 3 items in it already. And those items have been separated by a comma already. Now if we're going to separate the big parts of the list with commas, there's going to be a confusion between when the big items start, because one of the items already has 3 sub-items and uses a comma within that big item, if you get the idea. And using a comma then to separate the other main items in the list is going to be awful. That's when we can use a semicolon as well, as this next, hopefully you can see, example shows. So that's when we use semicolons, folks. Very, very simple. And I think if you try not to write sentences of this form, where you have adjacent main clauses, no need for a semicolon, and if you are very careful with how you write your lists, and you don't necessarily have this potentially confusing setup of one item already using a comma, then there's no need to use semicolons in your writing whatsoever, because it is a very challenging and quite difficult piece of punctuation to make. If you have a look at these examples, you can see the misuse of the semicolons. The first one, no need for a semicolon after questioning. Instead of a semicolon, this is a typical mistake. We've got pretty much a dependent clause. It should be a comma following copies, and the main clause starts immediately after. And here's a list, the 1, the 2, no need for a semicolon there either. And so the student writing this particular passage or sentence is dropping the semicolon in almost randomly, without any understanding of its function within the English language and within English for academic purposes. Let's have a look at this next sentence. Trends indicated that consumers were indeed affected by cost in their decision. Gee, that sounds like a full idea. Great. Semicolon. You could put a full stop here if you wanted, but the student's chosen to mark the end of this main clause with a semicolon. Good. Moreover, transition, header element, introductory element, comma. Good punctuation. And so the student has actually written this third passage, or quite extensive sentence, very, very effectively. I probably would suggest you did use a full stop instead of a semicolon here, but technically it is correct. All right, the poor old comma, sometimes just treated as a anywhere will do element. Again, it's like people just have a handful of commas and just distributing the commas throughout their text. No, they play a very specific role as well. As I've said, if you start a sentence with a header element, an introductory element, such as an adverb or a connective word, such as however, it's however, comma. Interestingly, comma. Good. If you start a sentence with a, let's get rid of some of this. If you start a sentence with a dependent clause, followed by your main clause, it's dependent clause, comma. All right, so those logical elements being separated by commas. As you can see in the examples here, overall, comma, even though there is some dispute, comma, that's what I'm looking for. Great. Relative clauses, those clauses which start with who, which, what, and then, yes? The argument, comma, which was presented by XYZ author, comma, and verb and the completion of the sentence. That's how we use commas another time. And of course, it's important that we use commas when we are writing lists. Now, a question that always comes up, I don't know why, it's funny the questions that students get fixated on, but they do. Here's the question of the Oxford comma. So you've got a list and you've got 3 items in the list. Is it necessary to put a comma here? X, Y, comma, and Z. Well, check your style guide. Some style guides say yes, they do want the so-called Oxford comma. Others don't prescribe it. Others actually don't want it. So check your style guide. In my estimation, if there's no guidance given as to whether or not it should be used, I would not use it. That's just a personal preference. But if it is either encouraged or discouraged, you follow the style guide, please. Now, earlier on in the program, we discussed this issue of comma splice and fused sentences as 2 particularly problematic grammatical mistakes students can make when misusing punctuation. Just to reiterate what we're talking about here, we've got 2 main clauses. Obviously, the first one stops somewhere and the second one starts. It's all about what happens here. Remember we talked about the sumo wrestler and the poor little EAP lecturer unable to stop these big, bulky main clauses from fighting each other for control of a sentence? If we just insert a comma, the comma isn't adequate, isn't strong enough to separate the 2 main clauses. So that's what we term an error splice. Yes? Good, a comma spliced error. Come on, Matthew, you get it right. It is summer, but you shouldn't be half-baked. Comma spliced error. We don't just use a comma to separate the main clauses in this sort of compound sentence. If we don't have any punctuation, remember, we term this a fused sentence because there's nobody there then trying to separate these 2 main clauses and they just crash into each other. They fuse. Right? That's a fused sentence, no punctuation at all. Put a comma, still not correct. It's a comma splice error. What we need is a semicolon or a coordinating conjunction and or but since or a connective like however, and remember the rule, it's always however, comma. All right, that's what this slide is telling you about. I want you to be able to define, at least recognize a comma splice error and a few sentence error. I can guarantee they will be on the quiz. You'll be given a number of sentences. Is this a few sentence or is it a comma splice error? Good. So here are some examples of how to and how not to use the full colon. Quite a common punctuation element, especially in some areas of the natural, physical, biological sciences. Yes, lists are important, A, B, C, and when we use it to set off a list, I'm arguing, please, that you set off the list after a noun. Let's have a look at our examples. Moods is a noun, comma, and then the three parts of the set, comma, full colon. A significant one. One is a noun, pronoun of sorts, then the full colon. Good. I want you to avoid using the full colon after verbs. Here are some examples. The main reasons were full colon. No. What you're doing there is, in a sense, splitting the verb and its object some of the time, even though were is not seen to be a transitive verb, but it's unnecessarily breaking the logical flow of the sentence after the verb. So the consequences might include, no need for the full colon there, just run the sentence off in a way the verb here is indeed a transitive verb, and what you're doing is breaking the logical connection between the verb and its object by inserting a full colon. Bad style, in my opinion. And certainly in the third example, in conclusion, full colon, no, that again is awkward and in a way displays a certain immaturity in your writing style. Good. So, there we have it for the Module 5A on punctuation. A great way to improve your punctuation is simply to certainly do the exercises for the tutorial, but follow up with some additional exercises online, or get one of those very good grammar books that has a whole range of different exercises around these issues for you to complete. Practice in regards to punctuation nearly makes perfect. Okay, good-o.